Hello, Bravs. We're back with The Golem Remembered 1909 to 1988. 1980 Variations of a Jewish Legend by Arnold L. Goldsmith. Pardon for the mylar jacket causing a reflection. Chapter 1, which will be broken up into two parts since it's 16 pages. And I usually will only read about 8 to 10 pages at a time because it's just too strenuous, brav. Chapter 1. The Two Judah Loews. Historical and legendary. Anyone interested in the Golem of Prague is faced with some intriguing mysteries. Certain tantalizing questions demand answers. How, for example, do scholars explain the cluster of fantastic legends developing around a 16th century rabbi 200 and more years after his death? How does one account for Judah Loews becoming wrapped in a mantle of magic? Why Judah Loew? To shrug off the mystery and simply refer to the vagaries of folk imagination does not satisfy the inquisitive mind. Too many ironies emerge. First, it is one of the fascinating ironies of Jewish literary history that a man who in real life did not believe in miracles became in legend responsible for one of the greatest miracles ever allegedly performed, the creation of a man from clay. Second, it is equally ironic that the same 16th century rabbi who condemned magic should, since the 18th century, be identified in legend with feats of magic that dazzled an emperor and his court. And third, it is somewhat miraculous itself that this same man, during his lifetime and centuries later, should have had such immense appeal to both rational scholars and mystics, to believers both in the Enlightenment and in the Kabbalah. It is this historical figure, Rabbi Judah Bezalel, Bezalel, sometimes spelled Loeb, Leva, Levi, or Levi, sorry. Lovi or Levi. Don't ever ask me to read these names again, please. Frequently called the Maharal, an acronym for the Hebrew Morenu Ha-Rav, rabbi in Jewish legends, that he eventually made his debut in drama, novel, short story, film, opera, and ballet. This chapter then serves to introduce the real Judah Loew and the legendary. Sometimes the two figures seem inseparable, sometimes they are worlds apart. The historical Rabbi Loew. Throughout their history, the Jews of the diaspora looked for heroic figures who could mitigate their suffering and lead them to the messianic redemption that their religion taught them to expect. 16th century Bohemian Jews had more than their share of enemies, both within and outside the religion. Apostate Jews who broke under persecution and converted to Christianity, unlike the Maranists, those converts who tried to practice their original religion covertly, turned on their co-religionists, partly as a result of their guilty consciences. In addition, of course, there was the long-standing conflict with Christianity, a polemical dispute which erupted periodically with dire consequences for the vulnerable minority. And from the world of the Kabbalah, Rabbi Ben Zion Boxer describes the nature of this persecution. In 1959, all Hebrew books in Prague were seized to be examined for possible anti-Christian reference. The contemporary historian David Gans reports that not even a single prayer book was left, and that the cantor had to chant the prayers orally, that is, from memory. The Talmud was burned 6 times in the course of the 16th century. In 15 1553, 1555, 1559, 1566, 1592, and 1599. A Christian censorship of Hebrew books was introduced in 1562. In 1561, under the instigation of the Jesuits, an order was issued forcing Jews to listen to Christian sermons, which disparaged their own faith and extolled the virtues of Christianity. Even Martin Luther, who began his ministry with the apparent intention of improving the lot of the Jews, was really trying to soften their resistance to Christianity as a first step to conversion, and he then turned bitterly against them. According to Frederick Dieberger, though the Jews were forced to wear yellow badges, were not allowed to trade in many articles, and suffered from horrible pogroms, and expulsion orders, the worst could always be averted by playing on the threat of Turkish aggression, and by the religious wars amongst the Christians. Another mitigating factor was a certain humanitarian attitude amongst the sovereigns, such as Ferdinand I, Maximilian I, and Rudolph II. For example, in 1850, Rudolph II repeated the restrictions forbidding Jewish furriers to make fur coats or fur-trimmed dresses and allowed Bohemian Jews to trade freely, but at the same time, he renewed the edict that the Jews had to wear on their attire the yellow badge of identification, and in 1585 he even sanctioned the expulsion of the few Jews in Schönberg in Moravia. One of the most interesting documents recording the religious disputations between the Catholic Church and the Jews, which occurred even before Rabbi Loew arrived in Prague in 1573, is Nizahan by Rabbi Yom Tab Muehlhausen, who frequently debated with both Christian priests and apostate Jews, currying favor with their new church by slandering their old religion. Rabbi Muehlhausen's career is probably the prototype for the many legends which later circulated about Rabbi Loew and his polemical disputes with the spokesman for Catholicism. The most famous of these depicts Judah Loew as the champion of his religion in a debate with 300 priests, whom he took on in groups of 10 for 30 days. Though, as Boxer points out, there is no evidence that such a debate ever occurred, the folk imagination was on solid ground in the essential ingredients of which it built its story. One of the greatest themes in the writing of Rabbi Judah was the defense of Judaism against the challenge of Christianity. This theme is central to most of Yudel Rosenberg's and Chaim Bloch's tales. Though Rabbi Loew was a prolific writer, 15 works were published during his lifetime, and one was published posthumously, while a number of his manuscripts were lost in a fire in 1689. He told very little about himself. Personal notes are rare in his writings. According to Boxer, our principal sources of knowledge about him are indirect, occasional comments by contemporaries, a tombstone inscription which extols his many-sided accomplishments, and family chronicles in which an oral tradition is reduced to writing for the benefit of posterity. The author of the family chronicles, Megillith Ukazin, was Meyer Perlis, a descendant who, as secretary of the Prague Jewish community, was asked in 1727 by Rabbi Isaiah Katz abroad in Moravia to write about his famous ancestor. The chronicles were not published until 1745, when they appeared as a supplement to Mate Mosh by Moses Katz, Rabbi Katz's son. It is important to make clear immediately that in this work, published almost a century and a half after Rabbi Loew's death, there is no mention of any of the legends which today are so well known. There is some uncertainty as to the date of Rabbi Loew's birth, but it was probably around 1512. Whatever the exact date, it is agreed that Judah Loew ben Bezalel, I'll just go with Bezalel, was born into a distinguished Jewish family, which was originally from Worms, but settled in Poland because of anti-Semitism. His three older brothers, Chaim, Sene, and Samson, also became accomplished scholars. One of the personal stories told by Perlis and repeated by Rosenberg and Bloch concerns Judah Loew's engagement to Pearl Reich, a young woman 4 years older than he. When her father suffered financial reverses, he offered Judah the chance to break the engagement, but Judah refused. The wedding was put off for 10 years. Damn, these people are dedicated. For 10 years while Pearl established herself in a bakery to help support her family. Though Pearl was already 30 when she finally married Judah, she bore him 7 children, 6 girls and a boy. The daughters, all of whom married well, are telescoped into one for changed to a granddaughter in the legends and stories about their famous father 200 to 400 years later. The son, Bezalel, mentioned in a small but significant way in Abraham Rothberg's Sword of the Golem, became a rabbi in Cologne and then became embittered when he was turned down as his father's successor in Prague. He left the city to head a rabbinical academy in Cologne before he died in 1600, 9 years before his father. From 1553 to 1573, Judah Loew served as rabbi of the province of Moravia. Little is known about his career during this time, but when he left Nikolsburg for Prague in 1573, he was independently wealthy and seeking new challenges. Over 60, but apparently in good health, he set out to continue his career as educator and rabbi, determined now to publish some of his writings. Why Rabbi Loew came to Prague is unclear, however. He had not been invited to become the city's chief rabbi. In fact, contrary to the impression given in legend and fiction, he held that position for only a small fraction of his career. Why, then, did he come? Dieberger is probably correct in suggesting that the main attraction was the exciting intellectual life which the city offered. Prague was an important cultural center of Judaism long before Rabbi Loew arrived. The most important books of the 16th century were being printed in Prague by the descendants of a printer named Gerson, who at the beginning of the century had been designated by the emperor as the only printer of books written in Hebrew. The availability of a Hebrew press is a factor that cannot be underestimated. It was this press that published most of Rabbi Loew's work in his old age. Another attraction in Prague was the new Klaus Synagogue, built through the generosity of Mordecai Mazel, the great philanthropist and Rabbi Loew's devoted friend, in commemoration of Emperor Rudolph's friendly visit to the Jewish ghetto in 1571. Rabbi Loew became the head of the new academy attached to the synagogue and served with distinction in the capacity for 11 years, making significant changes in the sterile pedagogy of the time and becoming known throughout Central Europe as a leading Jewish educator. His writings dealt with questions of halakha, that is, interpretations of scriptural law, but it was his love for Agada, the Jewish tradition of stories and legends, which were used to teach Talmudic wisdom, that endeared him to his followers. Among his published writings are several sermons, a popular book on piety and morals, and studies of Rashi's biblical commentaries. Divine Providence in the Early History of Israel, Scriptural Law, the Messianic Hope of Judaism, the Book of Esther, and the Hanukkah Festival. Despite his renowned brilliance and other eminent qualifications, Judah Loew was not elected chief rabbi of Prague in 1583. Isaac Hayat, his brother-in-law, was chosen instead. Apparently, Rabbi Loew had offended too many of the lay leaders of the Jewish establishment with his independent and outspoken views, for he had accused the oligarchy in Prague of making their rabbis spineless beggars. Moreover, traditionalists were offended by his attempts to introduce Kabbalistic ideas into his sermons and writings. One of his objections was to the hallowed High Holy Day prayer, in which man asked the angels to act as mediator between him and God. Rabbi Loew felt that man did not need any intermediaries in communicating with his Maker. In 1584, Rabbi Loew returned to Posen, where he was chief rabbi until 1588. After the resignation of his rival and relative, Rabbi Isaac Hyatt, he returned to Prague, but was again denied the prestigious position of chief rabbi and resumed his old post at the College of Klaus Synagogue. In 1859, he did return briefly to the Alt-Neuschel to deliver a scathing sermon excommunicating those Jews guilty of slandering certain distinguished Jewish families. The details of this unpleasant situation would reappear about 300 years later in one of the Golem legends. In 1592, a few weeks before his return to Posen as the new chief rabbi, probably the most famous event in Rabbi Loew's life occurred. He was invited for an audience with Emperor Rudolph II. Thieberger emphasizes the great significance of this short visit. One cannot be surprised that this audience greatly stirred the mind and the imagination of the Jews. For them, the sovereign was not only the personification of unlimited power on which their very life depended, but according to their religious conception, he embodied something holy, assigned to him directly from God, no matter whether he was a cruel or a gracious ruler. Suddenly, a member of the despised and persecuted Jewish people, considered as being outside the pale of the ordinary law, is granted the privilege of talking to a great sovereign of the time, not as a financial advisor, not as a political go-between, not as a physician, but as a Jew and as a friend. How many pages in are we? 3, 5. Go 3 more. There is no factual evidence to the subject of the conference, though there are many legends, but 2 of Rabbi Loew's contemporaries have confirmed that the meeting did take place. The first is David Gans, one of the rabbi's students, a historian and scientist, who reported in his chronicles that Emperor Rudolph sent for Rabbi Loew and had a long, friendly, confidential conversation with him on Sunday, 10 Adar 53-52. According to Thieberger, Gans' date is in error by 1 week. The other contemporary source is the eyewitness report of Yitzhak Cohen, Rabbi Loew's son-in-law. Chaim Bloch prints it in full as a long footnote to his chapter, The Audience with the Kaiser. In the Golem. He explains that it appeared in the 4th issue of the Hebrew paper Hamagid and Lik in 1872, edited by Dr. L. Silberman. Thieberger supplies additional information. Apparently, Yitzhak Cohen originally recorded his experience in his Venetian Bible, the newly discovered source of the report in Hamagid. According to Cohen, Rabbi Loew was invited to appear in Prince Berthier's apartment adjoining Emperor Rudolph's castle. He went there accompanied by his brother, Rabbi Sinai, his son-in-law, and Isaac Weissel, the head of the Jewish community. The prince treated his guests cordially, even allowed them to keep on their skull caps. While Rabbi Sinai and the author were seated in one room, Rabbi Loew was escorted into an adjoining room where he sat facing the prince, who conversed with him about mystical matters in tones loud enough for the others to hear every word. The loudness was especially intended by the prince so that our sovereign, the emperor, who was standing behind a curtain at the back of my father-in-law, could hear everything. All at once there was silence. One could hear the noise caused by the scraping of the chairs when our sovereign, the emperor, lifted the curtain, advanced in all his majesty, and exchanged a few words with my father-in-law about the previously mentioned matters. He then retired again. All this took place at a distance of 6 to 8 ells from us. After another brief conversation with the prince, Rabbi Loews was led back to his companions. Hands were shaken all around, and the guests accompanied to the courtyard. Cohen's entry for that day ends. As to the subject of the conversation, it is only correct in matters affecting the sovereign to be silent about it. But if God grants us life, we shall disclose the subject when the time is ripe. I have recorded everything, only quite shortly, also the politeness shown us by the prince. The next day, Cohen added that Prince Berthier informed Isaac Weissel that the emperor had enjoyed his talk with Rabbi Loews. Yitzhak Cohen never did keep his promise to reveal the subject of the discussion, but it seems likely from his use of Nistarot, translated by Bloch as confidential matters and Dieberger as mystical matters, that the emperor, who was known to be an intellectual and lover of the arts and science, a cultured man who surrounded himself with famous figures like George Hufnagel, Jan Bruegel, Tycho Brahe, and Johann Kepler, was interested in the rabbi's deep knowledge of the Kabbalah. Many of the legends and stories involving this historical meeting mention the emperor's fascination with alchemy and his interest in the Zohar. According to Dieberger, Kabbalistic fantasy found the motive for the audience in the rabbi's magical devices, or in his elucidation of other certain riddles in the life of the emperor. The single audience grew into repeated mutual visits and the intercourse with the emperor into intercourse with other aristocrats. Some say that Rabbi Loews sought the audience with Rudolph II to end libels against the Jews and thus avoid any more mob violence and repressive legislation. But whatever the explanation, in history, legend, or fiction, it is hard to disagree with Boxer, who sees the audience with the emperor as a sign of Judah Loew's stature at the time. Information on the last 17 years of Rabbi Loew's life is also sparse. He finally became chief rabbi of Prague in the closing years of the 16th century. During this period, he also published 5 of his books, which had been written earlier but needed revision. Rabbi Loews remained active until 1600. He continued to lecture on the Mishnah at Claus College, worked on his writings, and spent considerable time settling disputes. In 1604, he resigned his post because of ill health and age. On August 22nd, 1609, 7 years before the death of William Shakespeare, Judah Loews died. 30 of his students eventually had the honor of being buried beside their teacher. A definitive study of Judah Loew's philosophy remains to be written. He was an extremely well-read man with the wide-ranging interests of a Renaissance scholar. One book in particular which he enjoyed studying deserves special mention here, the Zohar, the central work of Jewish mysticism. Perhaps authored in the 2nd century of the Common Era and thus antedating the Sefer Yetzirah, I don't know how to say it. First published in Spain by Moses de Leon, the Zohar is considered by Kabbalists of many continents to be as holy as the Bible and Talmud. Boxer explains Judah Loews' fascination with the Zohar. Whereas the Talmud said very little, at least not directly, about God and how we are to find a way to Him, here he found a continued preoccupation with the very question which stirred him most: questions about man and his destiny, questions about God, who was both hidden and near, beyond the universe, and yet the very breath of its being, a poetic glow suffused with warmth, and the romance of deep faith was distilled by the Kabbalistic writings. They struck a responsive chord in the imaginative Judah. Mysticism, a major component of Renaissance humanism, fascinated Christian as well as Jewish scholars in the 16th century. According to Boxer, the political and religious instability of the time and the collapse of the familiar conceptions of the universe undermined man's sense of personal security. Man's quest for God as an object of personal experience rather than of dogmatic knowledge spurred his interest in mysticism. The practical mystic, explaining God's work of creation in terms familiar to man's own experience, tried to unite himself with the divine forces governing all life. In this attempt, he performed secret rites, usually invoking the secret name of God and special combinations of letters and numbers, which would supposedly empower him to control events in the natural world. This attempt to control nature, to turn base metals into gold, or to discover the elixir of life, led in the 16th century to widespread interest in alchemy. Rabbi Loew, however, rejected this mixture of science and magic and relied solely on the Torah as the ultimate source of all man's knowledge about the world. It was the Torah, Thieberger explains, that was the core of Rabbi Loew's philosophy. The text of the Torah, through its unique combination of letters and words, conveys to man everything he needs to know in order to find his way both in thought and action through the perplexities of life, without being obsessed by the fear of getting lost in the universe. At the same time, every particle of the text is of cosmic significance which man can only surmise with awe. Man's knowledge and love of the Torah, the revealed Word of God, enable him to combine the material and the spiritual worlds. Rabbi Loew's disbelief in miracles is especially important to this study because of the way the behavior of the legendary rabbi contradicts the philosophy of the historical figure on whom he is based. According to the real Rabbi Loew, man must not call an event a miracle because it is beyond his comprehension. There can be no such things as a sudden change in the natural course of events because the order of such events is fixed. Rabbi Loew saw the two distinct worlds, the one lacking corporeality, and time as we know them, following its own divinely given laws. The other visible to our senses. How then does man explain what has appeared to be a miracle, such as water turning to blood or the parting of the Red Sea? To Rabbi Loew, these apparent miracles are only sudden glimpses man has given of events in the spiritual world. They actually have not happened here. Unlike Maimonides, who sought a rational explanation for everything, Rabbi Loew based his faith on intuitive acceptance. In Tifereth Yisrael, he wrote, "If we are able to find the reason, then the Torah would be no more than a textbook of medicine or natural history. It is here, however, not a question of the order of nature, i.e., of material causes and effects, but of a divine supernatural order. By fulfilling the commandments, we fulfill their supernatural purpose, cling to God, and purify ourselves." Rabbi Loew's use of the Torah as a bridge to connect the physical and spiritual worlds is a good example of the mystic's love of numbers. The importance of numbers in the interpretation of Jewish religious Literature is well known and can be observed, especially in the Middle Ages, when both Christian and Jewish scholars studied the Zohar because of their fascination with Kabbalah. In Tifereth Yisrael, Rabbi Loews based his philosophy on the tradition that there are 613 precepts in the Torah, 365 of them negative commands, and 248 positive. The 365 thou shalt nots correspond with the days of the year, which determine the movement of time in the corporeal world. When man observes these commandments, he keeps order in the lower material world. The 248 positive precepts, according to an old Jewish belief, correspond to the bones in the human body. The man who observes these precepts in his daily life, Rabbi Loews argued, is striving for perfection with every bone in his body, and thus approaches the perfection of the divine order in the spiritual world. As T. Berger points out, the negative precepts were meant to reduce the dangers lurking in the concrete world, whilst the positive ones, the number of which is noticeably smaller, are directed towards the absolute truth outside of space and time. And even though the chapter ends soon, or the section ends soon, I will stop there because I am running out of camera space. Goodbye, bruv. Goodbye.